The last topics that we're going to deal with this semester are surrounding evolution. This is often divided into multiple chapters depending on what kind of book that you're reading. So it might be divided like it is here in 13 being the theory of evolution, how populations evolve, and specific ways that evolution occurs. Another chapter might define what species are and how species occur. I find that it's really hard to talk about species, populations, and evolution without touching on all of these topics intermingled. So that's what we're going to do. So instead, what we're going to do is think about it in 4 different major questions. What is the theory of evolution and what evidence is there to support it? What is a species? How do populations change over time? What is selection and what kinds of selection are there? And where do new species come from? We're going to start by reviewing some material that we talked about way back to the very beginning of the semester. And that's the theory of evolution. Books often like to call it Darwin's theory of evolution, but you'll see pretty clearly that Darwin wasn't the only person who came up with these ideas. Before we go too far, let's go back to this idea about the difference between laws and theories. So when we say something is a law in biology, and we say something is a theory, how are those two things different? Students often like to think that laws are something that are concrete, they're absolutely true, and that theories are something that are just an idea. But the real difference is what these things are meant to do. In general, laws are going to describe a phenomenon that you can observe right now, while theories seek to explain why something occurs. Both are typically well-established concepts in science, but they can change as information increases. So, how did the theory of evolution develop, and what is the support for it? Since to be a theory, there must be something. The first written documentation of a philosopher thinking about human beings and what they were before they were perhaps human was Anaximander back in 610 BC. In the beginning, man was born from creatures of a different kind because other creatures are soon self-supporting, but man alone needs prolonged nursing. For this reason, he would not have survived if this has been his original form. Anaximander pondered over the idea that in order for human babies to make it to adulthood, there must have been adults to care for them. So where did those adults come from in the first place? In addition to his philosophy, Anaximander was interested in looking at development. In particular, he spent a lot of time looking at embryos. In this image, you can see embryos from multiple different animals: salamanders, humans, rabbits, chickens, and fish. From this picture, you can see that they're actually dramatically similar to one another. And because of this similarity, he came up with this idea that all life began in the ocean, because the simplest organism that everything else looked like was a fish. On the surface, this seems like a pretty good idea, except, Anaximander was a little bit crazy. He thought that we actually were fish, like super old fish that shed our skins. Okay, probably not. He did have this idea that we maybe started out as something else, and that all organisms were related by these similarities. Another famous research scientist was Lamarck. Lamarck had this idea that creatures evolved from low to high complexity. He considered organisms like worms and insects to be low complexity, and animals like mammals to be high complexity. That's pretty arbitrary, but we could kind of see where that comes from. He thought that the use or disuse of a structure might cause them to change, so if an organism used to fly but doesn't fly anymore, it might lose access to its wings. And that adaptation to the environment causes change. So anytime something is changing in the environment, we might expect the organism itself to change. These ideas don't seem that bad until you look at them a little bit closer. Lamarck frequently gets laughed at because, in his version of evolution, whether or not an organism uses a trait is what determines how the trait changes. So if you're a hungry giraffe and you can't reach the leaves, if you stretch your neck long enough, eventually your neck is going to get longer, and you're going to pass on that longer neck to your offspring. Now, I don't know about you, but I've wanted to get better at lots of things in my life, and practice makes perfect, but it certainly doesn't make a longer neck. And I can't say that my kid is particularly better at any of those things I practiced. So, in general, this hasn't been proven to be very true. A lot of other people have thought about this idea of the origin of species over time. All of them agree that things are in response to a changed environment, and that this might be because of changed needs, changed behaviors, use or disuse, maybe something you learn, could be shock, it could be some kind of assimilation. And quite a few of them agree that this somehow led to natural selection, the idea that some individuals were more fit than others. What Darwin actually contributed to the theory of evolution was the idea that there was already variation that existed in nature, and that's what natural selection actually acted upon. It wasn't things that people learned per se, or a traumatic experience, or wanting to be really tall, but some individuals just happened to have some kind of trait, and that made them advantageous at that time. So this is really what he contributed, and it's a super important aspect of the theory of evolution. So how did we get there? Well, a lot of this information was originally thought about on the Galapagos Islands. These are islands that are part of Ecuador in South America. If you look at them really closely, you can see in this image that they have very different environments. Some of the islands are pretty low and don't have very many mountains or hills, and others are quite a few mountains. The Galapagos are particularly famous for the diverse amount of life that lives there. Things like Darwin's finches, saltwater iguanas, the Sally Lightfoot crab, blue-footed boobies, I don't know what that red-breasted bird is there, and, well, of course, giant tortoises. Darwin's often thought of as the most famous tourist that's been to the Galapagos, but he didn't look like this when he went there. He actually went when he was a really young man. Darwin was a huge nerd, and he was really bored at home, and his favorite thing to do was to collect animals. And by collect animals, I mean, collect them. There's a great story in the book where he writes about wanting to collect some insects, and he had two, and they were brand new, and he didn't want to put one down, and then he saw a third, so he ended up putting one in his mouth so that he could get them all back to the ship. This guy was serious. While he was on the island, he noticed that there were a large number of finches, more than he had seen in any other location, and that they were very specific to the types of foods that they seemed to eat. Some of them had very thick bills for crushing seeds, some had very thin bills for eating insects, and others had very sharp bills for cutting things like cactus flowers. All in all, there were 15 different types of finches, and each one with a specialized environment. Darwin also noticed that the birds lived in very specific places. For example, birds like the mangrove finch and the medium tree finch only lived on one of the islands of the Galapagos, while other birds like the small ground finch appeared to live everywhere. Darwin wondered how so many different versions of this bird could possibly be in one place. He started with this idea that the species likely came from South America somehow, and that's how they all originally got to the island. Now, the bird that you see on the right here, Ptiaris obscurus, is the actual descendant of all of Darwin's finches. This has been confirmed by genetic analysis, so he wasn't too far off. This meant that all of the birds were connected by common ancestry. He also thought about, why are all these birds so different from one another? Some kind of pressure in their environment had to be applied. Generally, when we think about pressure, it falls into three major categories. Either there's predators on the island that some of them need to be able to escape from, there might be some sexual conflict between members in a species, or there might be issues with food availability. Now, there really aren't any predators on the Galapagos, and finches don't really have sexual conflict, so he hypothesized that this was related to food. The idea was that some individuals must have had traits that helped them survive in one way or another. These individuals would then be more likely to reproduce and thus pass those traits on. An example of this is shown in this comic over here by Prolific Pen Comics. Two birds are sitting thinking about how they're going to get access to a grub down at the bottom. One of the birds tries, but he can't reach, and another bird shows up with a different sized beak. They make fun of him for it because he looks different from them, but it's easy for him to get the food, and they're surprised. This bird is going to have an advantage. He's got to eat the grub, so he's going to be healthier and have more energy to expend on finding a mate. In order for Darwin's hypothesis to be true, we have to first have some source of variation. So let's look at the populations that are found on the island. Here we have two species of bird, Fuliginosa and Fortis. On Los Hermanos and Daphne Major, the birds live in isolation. They don't have any competition with one another, and they can eat all of the food that is available. It's advantageous here to have an intermediate beak size so that you can have access to all types of food, but there's still some variation in how big that beak happens to be. When the two birds live together on the same island like they do in San Cristobal and Flaviana Islands, we see then that the beaks become specialized. Fuliginosa is better at eating small foods with its small beak, and Fortis becomes better at eating big foods with its big beak. So when competition is applied, the small beaks get smaller and the big beaks get bigger. But the original variation was already there. Over time, if a trait is adaptive, it will become more common in the population because individuals who have it will be more likely to have offspring and pass that trait on. This process is called natural selection. Darwin's process requires two major observations and draws two inferences. The first observation is that heritable variation in individuals has to exist. Something about the individuals must be different, and that difference must be able to be passed on to offspring. The second is that overproduction of offspring must occur. This means that not all offspring have an equal opportunity to survive. From here, we can draw two inferences. The first is that individuals who are well suited to the environment will tend to have more offspring, and those offspring are more likely to survive, and that over time, favorable traits will accumulate in the population. It's important to stress here that individuals do not evolve. Evolution occurs at the population level. Just because you need to have a big beak doesn't mean that you will develop one, but the population as a whole will develop one over time due to natural selection, because individuals with smaller beaks will die out. This is the point where some students will say, okay, great, but I'm not so sure that the environment can really have that much of an effect on organisms and populations. So let's look at some real data. In the chart to the left, you can see the number of birds that have this size beak in millimeters. The data was collected in 1976, and the average beak size was 8.8 millimeters in width. It might not seem like a big difference, but the birds in the pictures on the right have beaks at the two extremes, with the bird on the left having a 7 millimeter beak and the bird on the right having an 11 millimeter beak. This is an obvious difference. For an animal this small, several millimeters is quite a bit. After this data was taken, there was a drought in the Galapagos. As you might imagine, droughts impact plants that are available in the area, and that means that food availability is going to change. Which plants are affected and how is going to depend on their root structure. In this image, you can see that plants have dramatically different root structures. These are all plants that are sometimes grown in prairies, except for Kentucky bluegrass, the plant all the way to the right here. If you ever wondered why it's so hard to keep a nice green lawn, it's because grass has extremely shallow roots and relies on constant rainfall to stay healthy. That means that it is not at all drought resistant, and it's going to die pretty fast when a drought happens. So larger plants with deeper roots, like trees and shrubs, are going to do better over time. There's a lot of variability in seeds too. Larger seeds tend to come from bigger plants, and these bigger plants also tend to be more drought resistant. So things like nuts from trees are more likely to be available during a drought, whereas seeds from things like grasses might not be. This means that during a drought, birds with larger beaks tend to have an advantage because they can break open those bigger seeds from deeper rooted plants. And that's exactly what the scientists saw when they went back and measured when the drought was over in 1978. The average beak size had increased by an entire millimeter. Now that's something interesting to say if it happened only one time, but it actually happens every time a dry year happens. So if we look at beak size over time at the Galapagos Islands, we can see that for this bird, we see an increase in beak size every time there's a dry year. Once in 1977, again in 1980, again in 1982. And in fact, we can follow this like clockwork. So even a year's worth of drought is enough to cause noticeable change in a bird. So why doesn't this increase in beak size persist? Well, in wet years, there are tons of seeds that the smaller beaked birds have an advantage at eating. So we actually want to keep small beaks in case there's a really wet season. Permanent changes are difficult to get, and we'll talk a little bit more about them when we get to speciation. Suffice it to say, there are enough differences in the foods that are available and the types of environments on each of these islands that a lot of specialized birds have since evolved. And that's where species comes from. If you have these small effects and they happen long enough, then you can form a new species over time. So the key ideas here are that all life shares a common ancestor. Natural selection acts on natural variation in a population. This is variation that already existed. Individuals with beneficial traits are more likely to pass those traits on to the next generation. And over time, those traits can become more common. If this happens long enough, eventually it can lead to speciation. There are a lot of different myths that I hear about evolution when I'm teaching courses like this. So I'm going to go over a couple of them. The first one is that the theory of evolution says that humans evolved from monkeys. That's not actually true. The theory of evolution says that humans and monkeys share a common ancestor. And common ancestors are species that were neither of the current ones. So that means that our common ancestor was neither a monkey nor a human. I also sometimes hear that you can't believe in God and evolution at the same time. That's not true either. Evolution makes no comments on whether a deity exists or where life ultimately came from. It only seeks to explain why and how populations change over time. That's of course not true if you're talking about young Earth creationists who reject things like fossil records, and literal creationists are the only exceptions. But in general, it doesn't say those things, and it's not a problem for people who are devout. In fact, Darwin himself was very religious. It's also not really something you can believe in or not. It's a theory. You either agree that there's support for it or you don't. So moving on to that, let's